Cultivated fields, replied Nicole, shrugging his shoulders. Plowed, at all events, retorted Michel Ardan. But what laborers those Selenites must be, and what giant oxen they must harness to their plow to cut such furrows. They are not furrows, said Barbicane. They are rifts. Rifts stuff, replied Michel mildly. But what do you mean by rifts in the scientific world? Barbicane immediately enlightened his companion as to what he knew about lunar rifts. He knew that they were a kind of furrow found on every part of the disk which was not mountainous. That these furrows, generally isolated, measured from 400 to 500 leagues in length. That their breadth varied from 1,000 to 1,500 yards, and that their borders were strictly parallel. But he knew nothing more either of their formation or their nature. Barbicane, through his glasses, observed these rifts with great attention. He noticed that their borders were formed of steep declivities. They were long parallel ramparts, and with some small amount of imagination, he might have admitted the existence of long lines of fortifications, raised by Selenite engineers, of these different rifts. Some were perfectly straight, as if cut by a line. Others were slightly curved, though still keeping their borders parallel. Some crossed each other, some cut through craters. Here they wound through ordinary cavities, such as Posidonius or Petavius. There they wound through the seas, such as the Sea of Serenity. These natural accidents naturally excited the imaginations of these terrestrial astronomers. The first observations had not discovered these rifts. Neither Helius, Cassin, La Hire, nor Herschel seemed to have known them. It was Schroeder who in 1789 first drew attention to them. Others followed who studied them, as Pastor Gruithuisen, Barr, and Modler. At this time their number amounts to 70. But, if they have been counted, their nature has not yet been determined. They are certainly not fortifications, any more than they are the ancient beds of dried-up rivers. For, on one side, the waters, so slight on the moon's surface, could never have worn such drains for themselves. And, on the other, they often cross craters of great elevation. We must, however, allow that Michel Ardan had an idea, and that, without knowing it, he coincided in that respect with Julius Schmidt. Why, said he, should not these unaccountable appearances be simply phenomena of vegetation? What do you mean? Asked Barbicane quickly. Do not excite yourself, my worthy president, replied Michel. Might it not be possible that the dark lines forming that bastion were rows of trees regularly placed? You stick to your vegetation, then, said Barbicane. I like, retorted Michel Ardan, to explain what you savants cannot explain. At least my hypothesis has the advantage of indicating why these rifts disappear, or seem to disappear, at certain seasons. And for what reason? For the reason that the trees become invisible when they lose their leaves, and visible again when they regain them. Your explanation is ingenious, my dear companion, replied Barbicane, but inadmissible. Why? Because, so to speak, there are no seasons on the moon's surface, and that, consequently, the phenomena of vegetation of which you speak cannot occur. Indeed, the slight obliquity of the lunar axis keeps the sun at an almost equal height in every latitude above the equatorial regions. The radiant orb almost invariably occupies the zenith, and does not pass the limits of the horizon in the polar regions. Thus, according to each region, there reigns a perpetual winter, spring, summer, or autumn, as in the planet Jupiter, whose axis is but little inclined upon its orbit. What origin do they attribute to these rifts? That is a question difficult to solve. They are certainly anterior to the formation of craters and sickles, for several have introduced themselves, by breaking through their circular ramparts. Thus it may be that, contemporary with the later geological epochs, they are due to the expansion of natural forces. But the projectile had now attained the 40th degree of lunar latitude, at a distance not exceeding 40 miles. Through the glasses objects appeared to be only 4 miles distant. At this point under their feet rose Mount Helicon, 1,520 feet high, and round about the left rose moderate elevations, enclosing a small portion of the Sea of Rains under the name of the Gulf of Iris. The terrestrial atmosphere would have to be 170 times more transparent than it is, to allow astronomers to make perfect observations on the moon's surface. But in the void in which the projectile floated no fluid interposed itself between the eye of the observer and the object observed, and more, Barbicane found himself carried to a greater distance than the most powerful telescopes had ever done before, either that of Lord Rosse or that of the Rocky Mountains. He was, therefore, under extremely favorable conditions for solving that great question of the habitability of the moon. But the solution still escaped him. He could distinguish nothing but desert beds, immense plains, and toward the north arid mountains. Not a work betrayed the hand of man, not a ruin marked his course. Not a group of animals was to be seen indicating life, even in an inferior degree. In no part was there life, in no part was there an appearance of vegetation. Of the three kingdoms, which shared the terrestrial globe between them, one alone was represented on the lunar, and that the mineral. Ah, indeed, said Michel Ardan, a little out of countenance. Then you see no one. No, answered Nicholl, up to this time, not a man, not an animal, not a tree. After all, whether the atmosphere has taken refuge at the bottom of cavities, in the midst of the sickles, or even on the opposite face of the moon, we cannot decide. Besides, added Barbicane, even to the most piercing eye a man cannot be distinguished farther than 3.5 miles off. So that, if there are any Selenites, they can see our projectile, but we cannot see them. Toward 4 in the morning, at the height of the 50th parallel, the distance was reduced to 300 miles. To the left ran a line of mountains capriciously shaped, lying in the full light. To the right, on the contrary, lay a black hollow resembling a vast well, unfathomable and gloomy, drilled into the lunar soil. This hole was the Black Lake. It was Pluto, a deep circle, which can be conveniently studied from the Earth, between the last quarter and the new moon, when the shadows fall from west to east. This black color is rarely met with on the surface of the satellite. As yet it has only been recognized in the depths of the sickle of Endymion, to the east of the cold sea, in the northern hemisphere, and at the bottom of Grimaldi's sickle, on the equator, toward the eastern border of the orb. Pluto is an annular mountain, situated in 51 north latitude and 9 east longitude. Its circuit is 47 miles long and 32 broad. Barbicane regretted that they were not passing directly above this vast opening. There was an abyss to fathom, perhaps some mysterious phenomenon to surprise. But the projectile's course could not be altered. They must rigidly submit. They could not guide a balloon, still less a projectile, when once enclosed within its walls. Toward 5 in the morning, the northern limits of the Sea of Rains was at length passed. The mounts of Condamine and Fontenelle remained on the right, the other on the left. That part of the disk beginning with 60 was becoming quite mountainous. The glasses brought them to within 2 miles. Less than that separating the summit of Mont Blanc from the level of the sea. The whole region was bristling with spikes and sickles. Toward the 60 Philolaus stood predominant at a height of 5,550 feet, with its elliptical crater, and seen from this distance, the disk showed a very fantastical appearance. Landscapes were presented to the eye under very different conditions from those on the earth, and also very inferior to them. The moon having no atmosphere, the consequences arising from the absence of this gaseous envelope have already been shown. No twilight on her surface. Night following day and day following night with the suddenness of a lamp, which is extinguished or lighted amid profound darkness. No transition from cold to heat, the temperature falling in an instant from boiling point to the cold of space. Another consequence of this want of air is that absolute darkness reigns, where the sun's rays do not penetrate, that which on earth is called diffusion of light, that luminous matter which the air holds in suspension, which creates the twilight and the daybreak, which produces the umber and penumber, and all the magic of chiaro oscuro, does not exist on the moon. Hence the harshness of contrasts, which only admit of 2 colors, black and white. If a Selenite were to shade his eyes from the sun's rays, the sky would seem absolutely black, and the stars would shine to him as on the darkest night. Judge of the impression produced on Barbicane and his 3 friends by this strange scene. Their eyes were confused, they could no longer grasp the respective distances of the different planes. A lunar landscape, without the softening of the phenomena of chiaro oscuro, could not be rendered by an earthly landscape painter. It would be spots of ink on a white page, nothing more. This aspect was not altered even when the projectile, at the height of 80, was only separated from the moon by a distance of 50 miles. Nor even when, at 5 in the morning, it passed at less than 25 miles from the mountain of Gioia, a distance reduced by the glasses to a quarter of a mile. It seemed as if the moon might be touched by the hand. It seemed impossible that, before long, the projectile would not strike her, if only at the North Pole, the brilliant arch of which was so distinctly visible on the black sky. Michel Ardan wanted to open one of the scuttles and throw himself onto the moon's surface. A very useless attempt, for if the projectile could not attain any point whatever of the satellite, Michel, carried along by its motion, could not attain it either. At that moment, at 6 o'clock, the lunar pole appeared, the disk only presented to the traveler's gaze 1/2 brilliantly lit up, while the other disappeared in the darkness. Suddenly the projectile passed the line of demarcation between intense light and absolute darkness, and was plunged in profound night. Chapter 14. THENIGHTOF THRE 100 AND 50 FOUR hours AND HALF. At the moment when this phenomenon took place so rapidly, the projectile was skirting the moon's north pole, at less than 25 miles distance. Some seconds had sufficed to plunge it into the absolute darkness of space. The transition was so sudden, without shade, without gradation of light, without attenuation of the luminous waves, that the orb seemed to have been extinguished by a powerful blow. Melted, disappeared, Michel Ardan exclaimed, aghast. Indeed, there was neither reflection nor shadow. Nothing more was to be seen of that disk, formerly so dazzling. The darkness was complete and rendered even more so by the rays from the stars. It was that blackness in which the lunar nights are insteeped, which lasts 354 hours and a half at each point of the disk, a long night, resulting from the equality of the translatory and rotary movements of the moon. The projectile, urged in the conical shadow of the satellite, experienced the action of the solar rays no more than any of its invisible points. In the interior, the obscurity was complete. They could not see each other, hence the necessity of dispelling the darkness, however desirous Barbicane might be to husband the gas, the reserve of which was small. He was obliged to ask from it a fictitious light and expensive brilliancy, which the sun then refused. "Devil take the radiant orb," exclaimed Michel Ardan, "which forces us to expend gas, instead of giving us his rays gratuitously." "Do not let us accuse the sun," said Nicole, "it is not his fault, but that of the moon, which has come and placed herself like a screen between us and it." "It is the sun," continued Michel. "It is the moon," retorted Nicole. An idle dispute, which Barbicane put an end to by saying, "My friends, it is neither the fault of the sun nor of the moon. It is the fault of the projectile, which, instead of rigidly following its course, has awkwardly missed it. To be more just, it is the fault of that unfortunate meteor, which has so deplorably altered our first direction." "Well," replied Michel Ardan, "as the matter is settled, let us have breakfast. After a whole night of watching, it is fair to build ourselves up a little." This proposal meeting with no contradiction, Michel prepared the repast in a few minutes, but they ate for eating's sake. They drank without toasts, without hurrahs, the bold travelers being borne away into gloomy space, without their accustomed course of rays, felt a vague uneasiness in their hearts. The strange shadow so dear to Victor Hugo's pen bound them on all sides, but they talked over the interminable night of 354 hours and a half, nearly 15 days, which the law of physics has imposed on the inhabitants of the moon. Barbicane gave his friends some explanation of the causes and the consequences of this curious phenomenon. "Curious indeed," said they, "for, if each hemisphere of the moon is deprived of solar light for 15 days, that above which we now float does not even enjoy, during its long night, any view of the earth, so beautifully lit up, in a word, she has no moon," applying this designation to our globe, "but on one side of her disk. Now if this were the case with the if, for example, Europe never saw the moon, and she was only visible at the antipodes, imagine to yourself the astonishment of a European on arriving in Australia. They would make the voyage for nothing but to see the moon," replied Michel. "Very well," continued Barbicane, "that astonishment is reserved for the Selenites, who inhabit the face of the moon opposite to the earth, a face which is ever invisible to our countrymen of the terrestrial globe, and which we should have seen," added Nicole, "if we had arrived here, when the moon was new, that is to say 15 days later. I will add, to make amends," continued Barbicane, "that the inhabitants of the visible face are singularly favored by nature, to the detriment of their brethren on the invisible face. The latter, as you see, have dark nights of 354 hours, without one single ray to break the darkness, the other, on the contrary. When the sun, which has given its light for 15 days, sinks below the horizon, see a splendid orb rise on the opposite horizon. It is the earth, which is 13 times greater than the diminutive moon, that we know earth, which develops itself at a diameter of 2 degrees, and which sheds a light 13 times greater than that qualified by atmospheric strata earth, which only disappears at the moment when the sun reappears in its turn. Nicely worded, said Michel, slightly academical perhaps. It follows then, continued Barbicane, without knitting his brows, that the visible face of the disk must be very agreeable to inhabit, since it always looks on either the sun, when the moon is full, or on the earth, when the moon is new. But, said Nicholl, that advantage must be well compensated by the insupportable heat, which the light brings with it. The inconvenience, in that respect, is the same for the two faces, for the earth's light is evidently deprived of heat, but the invisible face is still more searched by the heat than the visible face. I say that for you, Nicholl, because Michel will probably not understand. Thank you, said Michel. Indeed, continued Barbicane, when the invisible face receives at the same time light and heat from the sun, it is because the moon is new. That is to say, she is situated between the sun and the earth. It follows, then, considering the position which she occupies in opposition when full, that she is nearer to the sun by twice her distance from the earth. And that distance may be estimated at the 200th part of that which separates the sun from the earth, or in round numbers 400,000 miles, so that invisible face is so much nearer to the sun when she receives its rays. Quite right, replied Nicholl. On the contrary, continued Barbicane. One moment, said Michel, interrupting his grave companion. What do you want? I asked to be allowed to continue the explanation. And why? To prove that I understand. Get along with you, said Barbicane, smiling. On the contrary, said Michel, imitating the tone and gestures of the president, on the contrary, when the visible face of the moon is lit by the sun, it is because the moon is full, that is to say, opposite the sun with regard to the earth. The distance separating it from the radiant orb is then increased in round numbers to 400,000 miles, and the heat which she receives must be a little less. Very well said, exclaimed Barbicane. Do you know, Michel, that, for an amateur, you are intelligent? Yes, replied Michel coolly. We are all so on the Boulevard des Italiens. Barbicane gravely grasped the hand of his amiable companion, and continued to enumerate the advantages reserved for the inhabitants of the visible face. Among others, he mentioned eclipses of the sun, which only take place on this side of the lunar disk, since in order that they may take place, it is necessary for the moon to be in opposition. These eclipses, caused by the interposition of the earth between the moon and the sun, can last 2 hours, during which time, by reason of the rays refracted by its atmosphere, the terrestrial globe can appear as nothing but a black point upon the sun. So, said Nicholl, there is a hemisphere, that invisible hemisphere, which is very ill supplied, very ill treated by nature. Never mind, replied Michel, if we ever become Selenites. We will inhabit the visible face. I like the light. Unless, by any chance, answered Nicholl, the atmosphere should be condensed on the other side, as certain astronomers pretend. That would be a consideration, said Michel. Breakfast over, the observers returned to their post. They tried to see through the darkened scuttles by extinguishing all light in the projectile, but not a luminous spark made its way through the darkness. One inexplicable fact preoccupied Barbicane. Why, having passed within such a short distance of the moon, about 25 miles, although the projectile had not fallen. If its speed had been enormous, he could have understood that the fall would not have taken place. But, with a relatively moderate speed, that resistance to the moon's attraction could not be explained. Was the projectile under some foreign influence? Did some kind of body retain it in the ether? It was quite evident that it could never reach any point of the moon. Whither was it going? Was it going farther from or nearing the disk? Was it being borne in that profound darkness through the infinity of space? How could they learn, how calculate in the midst of this night? All these questions made Barbicane uneasy, but he could not solve them. Certainly, the invisible orb was there, perhaps only some few miles off. But neither he nor his companions could see it. If there was any noise on its surface, they could not hear it. Air, that medium of sound, was wanting to transmit the groanings of that moon, which the Arabic legends call a man already half granite and still breathing. One must allow that was enough to aggravate the most patient observers. It was just that unknown hemisphere which was stealing from their sight, that face which 15 days sooner or 15 days later had been or would be splendidly illuminated by the solar rays, was then being lost in utter darkness in 15 days. Where would the projectile be? Who could say? Where would the chances of conflicting attractions have drawn it to? The disappointment of the travelers in the midst of this utter darkness may be imagined. All observation of the lunar disk was impossible. The constellations alone claimed all their attention. And we must allow that the astronomers, Faye, Charcanac, and Secchi, never found themselves in circumstances so favorable for their observation. Indeed, nothing could equal the splendor of this starry world, bathed in limpid ether. Its diamonds set in the heavenly vault sparkled magnificently. The eye took in the firmament, from the Southern Cross to the North Star, those two constellations which in 12,000 years, by reason of the succession of equinoxes, will resign their part of the polar stars. The one to Canopus in the southern hemisphere, the other to Vega in the northern. Imagination loses itself in this sublime infinity, amid which the projectile was gravitating, like a new star created by the hand of man. From unnatural cause, these constellations shone with a soft luster. They did not twinkle, for there was no atmosphere which, by the intervention of its layers unequally dense and of different degrees of humidity, produces this scintillation. These stars were soft eyes looking out into the dark night amid the silence of absolute space. Long did the travelers stand mute, watching the constellated firmament upon which the moon, like a vast screen, made an enormous black hole, but at length a painful sensation drew them from their watchings. This was an intense cold, which soon covered the inside of the glass of the scuttles with a thick coating of ice. The sun was no longer warming the projectile with its direct rays, and thus it was losing the heat stored up in its walls by degrees. This heat was rapidly evaporating into space by radiation, and a considerably lower temperature was the result. The humidity of the interior was changed into ice upon contact with the glass, preventing all observation. Nicholl consulted the thermometer and saw that it had fallen to 17 degrees centigrade, below zero, so that, in spite of the many reasons for economizing, Barbicane, after having begged light from the gas, was also obliged to beg for heat. The projectile's low temperature was no longer endurable. Its tenants would have been frozen to death. Well, observed Michel, we cannot reasonably complain of the monotony of our journey. What variety we have had, at least in temperature. Now we are blinded with light and saturated with heat, like the Indians of the Pampas. Now plunged into profound darkness, amid the cold, like the Esquimaux of the North Pole. No, indeed. We have no right to complain. Nature does wonders in our honor. But, asked Nicholl, what is the temperature outside? Exactly that of the planetary space, replied Barbicane. Then, continued Michel Ardan, would not this be the time to make the experiment, which we dared not attempt when we were drowned in the sun's rays? It is now or never, replied Barbicane, for we are in a good position to verify the temperature of space and see if Freer or Pouillet's calculations are exact. In any case it is cold, said Michel. See? The steam of the interior is condensing on the glasses of the scuttles. If the fall continues, the vapor of our breath will fall in snow around us. Let us prepare a thermometer, said Barbicane. We may imagine that an ordinary thermometer would afford no result under the circumstances in which this instrument was to be exposed. The mercury would have been frozen in its ball, as below 42 Fahrenheit below zero. It is no longer liquid, but Barbicane had furnished himself with a spirit thermometer on Wafferdin's system, which gives the minima of excessively low temperatures. Before beginning the experiment, this instrument was compared with an ordinary one, and then Barbicane prepared to use it. How shall we set about it? Asked Nicholl.